In 1882, Great Britain began to experience an increase in Irish immigrants, as well as Jewish refugees fleeing from the rest of Europe and into England. London in particular began to become increasingly overly populated. This led to housing conditions becoming worse. Around 55% of children born during this era died before they even hit the age of 5. Due to the increased population, robbery and violence began to also become a common problem. The economy struggled as well, which drove many women to sell themselves on the streets in order to survive. Due to the increased crime wave, someone walking around covered in blood would sadly arouse no suspicion, leading to the perfect opportunity for the most infamous serial killer in history to begin their rampage. On December the 26th, 1887, an unidentified woman was supposedly found dead in a doorway near Commercial Road, with a stake thrusted into her abdomen. However, as strange as it sounds, it's uncertain if this attack actually took place or if it was just a myth. It's a story that circulated and was later linked to the iconic Jack the Ripper, but there were no recorded murders in the area around Christmas that year. Most believe this never took place, but it's speculated that there was confusion, as one of the later victims we're going to discuss had a similar fate, and they may have been mistaken for this fictional case. On February the 25th, 1888, 38-year-old widow Annie Millwood was attacked by a man with a knife and sent to a nearby infirmary. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the legs and lower torso. She was released but would unfortunately pass away on March the 31st, over a month later. It's believed that Annie may have been the Ripper's first victim, but not enough evidence came up to definitively link this killing to the others. On March the 28th, 1888, while Annie Millwood was still alive, Ada Wilson was attacked by a man with a similar weapon on her own doorstep in Bow, being stabbed twice in the neck, but she managed to survive. On April the 3rd, 1888, at around 1:30 AM, Emma Elizabeth Smith was robbed and sexually assaulted on Osborne Street. She was bludgeoned in the face and her ear had been cut. A blunt object was then violently inserted into her vagina, so much so it completely ruptured her peritoneum. It's believed that due to this, she was accidentally confused with the first unidentified woman, creating the false story. Regardless, Emma Elizabeth Smith later died the following day in hospital. During her final 24 hours, she claimed that she had been attacked by 2 or 3 men, one of which was a teenager, but most deny it being linked to Jack the Ripper, though nothing is for certain. 4 months later, on August the 7th, Martha Tabram was murdered on a staircase landing in George Yard. She received 39 stab wounds to her throat, lungs, heart, liver, spleen, stomach, and abdomen. She had also been stabbed in the breasts and vagina. All of these wounds seemed to come from a penknife and were delivered by somebody who was right-handed, but she hadn't been raped. Due to the similar brutality of the murders, and the fact they were in the same nearby vicinity, the police believed that these were all done by the same person. However, some of Tabram's wounds did differ from later victims, which led some experts to believe that they were actually unconnected. It wasn't until August when Jack the Ripper would officially strike. On August the 31st, 1888, around 3:40 AM, less than a month after Martha Tabram was killed. Mary Ann Nichols' body was found by a man named Charles Cross and his friend Robert Paul in Bucks Row. Her throat had been cut deeply twice, so much so it severed all of the tissue right down to the vertebrae. Her vagina had been stabbed twice and the lower part of her abdomen was ripped open, so much so her bowels were completely exposed. What's bizarre was that Mary was last seen alive about an hour before her body was discovered, not allowing the killer much time to have murdered her and performed these extravagant dissections of her body. A week later, on September the 8th, at around 6 AM, Annie Chapman's body was discovered by John Davis in Hanbury Street. Her throat was also cut deeply, her abdomen cut entirely open, and a whole section of her flesh was left over her shoulders. Pieces of her skin and flesh, including her intestines, were removed and placed over her other shoulder. Her uterus, parts of her bladder, and even her vagina had all been surgically removed. Much like Mary Ann Nichols, there wasn't a lot of time for the killer to have mutilated Annie Chapman's body, as she was last seen alive 30 minutes before her body was found. She was spotted talking to a man with dark hair, wearing a brown deerstalker hat and a dark overcoat. The man was heard asking Chapman, "Will you?" to which she replied,
"Yes."
On September the 27th, 1888, the police finally received a clue. The Central News Agency of London received a letter written in red ink dated 2 days earlier, claiming to have been from the killer himself. "Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. Haha. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly, wouldn't you? Keep this letter back till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Don't mind me giving the trade name. P.S. Wasn't good enough to post this before I got all the red ink off my hands. Curse it. No luck yet. They say I'm a doctor now. This was the first time the killer had a name, and it stuck for 134 years, though many doubt the legitimacy of it being from the murderer himself. The letter in question is filled with spelling mistakes and grammatical errors. However, he did seem to follow through with his promise. On September the 30th, 1888, Elizabeth Stride was found dead by Lewis Deemschutz at around 1 AM in Dutsfield Yard, off Burner Street. She was cut across the neck so deep it severed her left carotid artery and her trachea. However, she wasn't cut any further, leading some to believe that it wasn't done by the same person, or that they were possibly interrupted during the assault. Witnesses claimed they had seen Elizabeth with a man near the area not long before her body was discovered, but they gave different descriptions of the culprit. Some said he was fair-haired, others said dark, some said he was shabbily dressed, others claim well-dressed. That very same morning, Catherine Eddos was also found in Meter Square, not far from Elizabeth's body. Her throat had been severed and her abdomen ripped open, so much so her intestines were placed over her right shoulder. Her left kidney and major part of her uterus had been removed, her face disfigured, her nose severed, her cheeks slashed, and her eyelids had also been vertically cut. But amazingly, experts believe this was all done in just 5 minutes. Furthermore, parts of her auricle and earlobe had also been severed, just as the letter had promised days earlier. It seemed the author may genuinely have been the killer after all. Salesman Joseph Lyand had passed through the area shortly before the murder had taken place, and he claimed to have seen a fair-haired man with a shabby appearance with a woman who he thinks could have been Catherine Eddos. But friends with Joseph who were with him that night failed to make the same description of the man. A section of her bloodied apron was actually found by Alfred Long in Golstron Street, and above it, written on the wall, was a chalk inscription that read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." It seemed the killer was now blaming the local Jews for the murders, but it's unclear whether this was genuinely written by the murderer or whether it was already there as a form of graffiti and was a massive coincidence, or just a sick prank. However, the apron was found in between both bodies, and considering the murders took place on the same night within 10 to 15 minutes walking distance from each other, it appeared that the murderer killed Elizabeth Stride, then walked across town to murder Catherine Eddos, and then actually walked back towards the first body, where there would have been several police officers and a huge crime scene, where they then dropped the apron. This led to one particular theory, that Jack the Ripper was actually a woman. The authorities were looking for a man that matched the description of the stranger seen talking to the victims shortly before they were found. Therefore, it would have been incredibly easy for a woman to have walked through a busy, panicking crowd undetected. It's also a possibility that she may have been a midwife, which would explain her surgical knowledge of the human anatomy, and why nobody would question her being covered in blood that night. But this theory doesn't account for all of the eyewitnesses who claim to have seen the victims talking to a man not long before being found dead. They were looking for a male between the ages of 25 and 35, standing between 5'5" and 5'7", with fair complexion. They believed this man was targeting prostitutes, but was perfectly sane, was frighteningly normal, but capable of extraordinary cruelty. The previous letter was quickly published, in hopes of somebody identifying the handwriting, but all it led to was a barrage of hoax letters claiming to have been from the killer, but with no credibility, simply coining phrases from the original letter. On October the 1st, 1888, the day after the double murder, the news agency received a postcard, again claiming to have been from Jack the Ripper. "I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow double event. This time number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off, had not time to get ears off for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper." The press were receiving countless hoax letters, but this one gathered their interest in particular, as the double murder wasn't in the newspapers yet, and it wasn't public knowledge. But yet the author seemed to already know about it and the circumstances. The handwriting was analysed and compared to the first letter, and it was concluded to have belonged to the same individual. Every house in the area of the double murder was searched, but nothing was found. The investigation was so frustrating with so little leads that Police Chief Charles Warren actually resigned after they failed to catch the culprit. On October the 2nd, 1888, a headless torso of a woman was found in the basement of the police headquarters in Whitehall. Her arm and shoulder were actually discovered the previous month, floating in the River Thames, and her left leg was also found nearby on October the 17th. The remaining body parts were never found, and the identity of this woman remains a mystery. Due to the similar incisions and mutilations of the body parts, it is a possibility that the Ripper was responsible, though it remains unconfirmed. Some believe it was him, while others dubbed the murderer the Torso Killer, and denied them being from the same person. On October the 16th, 1888, yet another letter was received, this time personally by Vigilance Committee Chairman George Lusk. "From hell, Mr. Lusk, saw. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you to the piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me all you can, Mr. Lusk." The handwriting of this letter was analysed and confirmed to have been different to the previous two, leading some to believe that it was a hoax, while others believed the opposite, that the first two were fake and this one was legitimate. This letter wasn't signed by a name, but was personally delivered to George Lusk himself in a box that actually contained a real human kidney. The man who delivered this box was around 5'9", between the ages of 30 and 40 years old, with a bushy brown beard, whiskers and a mustache, all matching the descriptions of Jack the Ripper. Though some believe medical students could have obtained this from their studies and sent it as a prank. The kidney was investigated, and it was from a woman who was a struggling alcoholic, which did match the victim, Catherine Eddos, though nothing is confirmed. A shopkeeper claimed to have been visited by a strange, unsettling man at the time, who asked for the address of George Lusk. The man then wrote it down into a book and quickly left. He was slim, wearing a long black overcoat, around 6 foot tall, with a beard and mustache and a heavy Irish accent. Most believe that the shopkeeper, Emily Marsh, may have actually encountered Jack the Ripper, but the legitimacy of the kidney and the letter remain a mystery, with many more spelling issues present, though some believe it may have been a deliberate attempt to throw investigators off the scent. Over a month later, on November the 9th, 1888, at around 10:45 AM, the mutilated and disemboweled body of Mary Jane Kelly was discovered in her bed on Dorset Street. Her face had been hacked away so much she was no longer recognisable. Her throat had been cut down to the spine, and her abdomen had been completely emptied of all of its organs. Her uterus, kidneys and one breast had been cut out and placed beneath her head, while the rest of her insides were placed near her foot, and other sections of her innards and her thighs were placed on a bedside table, though her heart was cut out and was never found. These last 5 deaths, which would be known as the canonical 5, were all performed at night, near a weekend, either at the end of a month or the week after, and they gradually got more and more severe. Due to the similar operations of the killings, it was quickly believed that the same person had taken part in at least these 5 murders, though some dispute this and only believe they were responsible for 3 of them. Regardless, it's widely believed that Mary Jane Kelly was in fact the final victim, and that the murderer may have died, left the country or was imprisoned, which caused the end of his rampage, though it's all left up to speculation. All 5 murders no doubt were committed by the same hand. In the first 4, the throats appear to have been cut from left to right. In the last case, owing to the extensive mutilation, it is impossible to say in what direction the fatal cut was made, but arterial blood was found on the wall in splashes close to where the woman's head must have been lying. All the circumstances surrounding the murders lead me to form the opinion that the women must have been lying down when murdered, and in every case the throat was first cut. More than 2,000 people were interviewed, and around 300 directly investigated, with a reward of £500 for the capture and arrest of the serial killer. Naturally, butchers and surgeons were the primary focus, based on the sheer intricate knowledge of the human anatomy and dissection required for the assaults. However, all 76 of the local butchers had alibis that checked out and left suspicion. Some even believed that it may have been a butcher or cattle drover who committed the act, and then fled from London on a dock to mainland Europe. But none of the boats coincided with the murder's timelines, and this theory was soon discarded. However, Police Sergeant Thomas Bond did not believe that a butcher or anyone with professional knowledge of the human anatomy was responsible. He simply believed that it was the work of a clinical psychopath. The women were never raped, though some suffered vaginal injuries with the weapon, suggesting that the killer may have received sexual satisfaction from the assault alone. On November the 21st, 1888, Annie Farmer, who actually lived with Martha Tabram, was attacked and cut in the throat. An unidentified man was seen with blood on his mouth and hands running out of her home shouting, "Look at what she has done." Annie Farmer was heard screaming, and it's possible that her wound was actually self-inflicted, but it remains a mystery. On December the 20th, 1888, 26-year-old Rose Myler was found dead and strangled in High Street in Poplar. There were no signs of a struggle, but the police believed she had either accidentally hanged herself with a collar whilst drunk, or she had deliberately committed suicide. However, there were some faint markings on the cord to suggest that it may have actually been murder. On December the 29th, 1888. 7-year-old John Gill was found dead in a stable in Manningham, Bradford. His legs had been severed, his abdomen opened, his intestines partly torn out, and his heart and one ear were removed. Due to the vulgarity of the attack, it was believed that the Ripper was responsible. The boy's employer, William Barrett, was actually arrested for the murder, but later released as no evidence linked him to the attack. On July the 17th, 1889, just after midnight, Alice Mackenzie was murdered in Castle Alley. She had been stabbed twice in the neck, and her left carotid artery had been completely severed. She also suffered some minor bruises and cuts, one of which was a 7-inch long superficial wound stretching from her left breast to her navel. Examining pathologists believed this was the same murderer as the previous ones, but George Bagster Phillips, who had personally examined the bodies of the previous victims, disputed this. Some even believed this was a copycat killing, intending to deliberately mimic the previous ones to avoid blame. On September the 10th, 1889, an unidentified woman, somewhere between the age of 30 and 40 years old, was found dead beneath a railway arch in Pinchin Street. She had no head and no legs left. On her back, hip and arm there were severe bruises. Her abdomen was mutilated, but her genitals hadn't been touched. She was decomposing at the time of discovery, leading experts to believe she had been killed around a day before being found. On February the 13th, 1891, 25-year-old prostitute Frances Coles was found under a railway arch in Shallow Gardens. Her throat had been cut deep, but her body wasn't mutilated, leading people to believe again that the killer had been disturbed during the process. However, she was still alive when she was found, though she would pass away before medical care could arrive on the scene. 53-year-old stoker James Thomas Sadler had been spotted drinking with her earlier in the day, and around 3 hours before it's believed that she was killed, they had a loud argument. Due to this, he was arrested and actually charged with murder. He was believed to have been Jack the Ripper, but there wasn't enough evidence and he was discharged on March the 3rd, 1891. On April the 24th, 1891, Carrie Brown was strangled with some clothing and then mutilated with a knife in New York City. She suffered a huge tear through the groin area with more cuts on her legs and back. No other organs were removed from the crime scene, though an ovary was found on the bed. It looks similar to the scenes in London, but it's uncertain if this was the same person who found their way overseas and if it was completely unrelated. The fact that so many of the murders took place in nearby areas and around weekends or public holidays suggested that the killer was local and must have had a nearby job. One suspect was 40-year-old Montague Johnson Druitt, who lived with his cousin at the time in the area near the murders. He had a deep fascination with surgery, and he wrote in a diary that his mother was going insane and that he felt like he was as well. Not long after the final killing, Druitt vanished and was later found dead in the River Thames, citing this coincidence as enough evidence of his involvement. However, on September the 1st, 1888, just the day after Mary Ann Nichols was killed, Druitt was in Dorset playing cricket. On the very day that Annie Chapman was found dead, he was also playing cricket in Blackheath. And just the day after the double murders, he was in the West Country defending a client in court. It's not impossible that he would have been able to travel to and from these locations quickly on a train to find a conceivable alibi, but it's unlikely he would have been able to do so without leaving any kind of evidence or direct suspicion. Furthermore, he lived on the other side of the Thames to the murder areas and in the opposite direction of where the blood-stained apron was discovered. However, many believe Alice Mackenzie was actually killed by the same Ripper as the canonical five. What makes this damning is that she was killed 7 months after Druitt had already died, erasing him as possibly being Jack the Ripper. Another suspect was Michael Ostrog, who had previously been sent to an asylum for homicidal tendencies. It was later discovered that he was actually arrested and in prison in France in 1888, around the time of the murders, and therefore was not the man they were looking for. Another potential suspect is Aaron Kosminsky, who matched the description of eyewitness accounts of Jack the Ripper. He would frequently be sent to asylums not long after the killings and would stay there until his death in 1919. He was known to have a strong hatred for women and was in the area the night of the double murder. However, Kosminsky was a Polish Jew, disregarding the alleged anti-Semitic motives. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and would often self-harm. He had previously threatened his sister, but this was his only known violent outburst. Even during his time in the asylums, he was described as being completely harmless. Furthermore, he would mostly speak his own native language, and may not have been fluent in English, making it unlikely he would have been able to lure women into dark alleyways. But that's when some DNA evidence may have actually gone against him. A shawl was supposedly found with Catherine Eddos with DNA that, in 2014, was tested against the descendants of Aaron Kosminsky, and it matched. Though some believe the DNA could have been planted as his descendants were left alone with the shawl for days, and this supposed evidence may have been contaminated. But it seemed this finally ended the case, and proved that Aaron Kosminsky was Jack the Ripper. Unfortunately, it turned out that the study on the shawl was actually done incorrectly, and the wrong unit was input, so it wasn't a 100% match at all. It was a match for about 90% of people in Europe at the time. It could have been any of them. Aaron Kosminsky being Jack the Ripper remains a mystery. Another theory is that Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward may have been the killer. He had supposedly fathered a child in the area at the time, and some believed he murdered to try to cover it all up. He allegedly caught syphilis and went insane. He also had a history of visiting the areas of the murders a lot, though most dispute this claim. On the night of the double murder, Prince Albert was 500 miles away in Scotland with members of the royal family. But some even go as far as to claim the royals may have helped to cover up his crimes. Another potential suspect is Walter Sickert. He had been obsessed with the Jack the Ripper case, and had apparently stayed in a particular room that was rumoured to have lodged the Ripper himself years earlier, and he sometimes even liked to dress as Jack. Sickert later painted a picture of that very room and titled it Jack the Ripper's bedroom. However, in 1888, Sickert is believed to have spent most of his time outside of the UK, though this leads to more conflicting reports. Sickert claims to have been in France, but some claim to have seen him in London at the time of some of the murders. Experts analysed the Ripper's letters and some written by Sickert, and they did happen to use the exact same type of paper, which was unlikely back then. It has undented suspicion, as some believe he was an accomplice to the real killer. Some even trying to gain his DNA off of his paintings, but nothing has been definitively proven. Another suspect is Joseph Barnett, who actually lived with victim Mary Kelly at the time. He moved around London a lot and had told many people that he was actually in love with Mary. She was selling herself, which he was heavily against. Some suggest he may have murdered initially to scare her off the streets, which actually worked at first. He moved out just 10 days before she was found dead. What makes him a more likely suspect is that she was found murdered inside her own bed, where Barnett would have had access to, as he still had the bedroom door key and the room was locked. He was also a fish porter and would have been experienced in dissection. He asked his friends to call him Jack, and he did match the visual description. It's also worth noting that the killings stopped with Mary. He would have had no reason to continue murdering after that point. They did have violent arguments in the past, but appeared to be on the verge of reconciliation at the time of her death, though allegedly they had one final argument on October the 30th, 11 days before her body was found. Some believe he attempted to win her over and got rejected, and the killing was an act of rage. Furthermore, before the double murder, Catherine Eddos actually did suspect him, and he may have killed her to keep her quiet. After Annie Chapman was murdered, an envelope that belonged to him was found in the nearby courtyard. The location of the apron was on the way to Barnett's home, and there was a nearby fountain, which he could have used to clean up the mess. The final suspect is James Maybrick, who died just a year after the murders stopped. Maybrick actually lived in Liverpool, but if you remember, the killings always took place on the weekends, which is when Maybrick would like to visit London. Furthermore, years after his death, a diary was discovered under the floorboards of his Liverpudlian home. It doesn't state his name, but it's written about his own life and experiences to suggest that he was Jack the Ripper. However, this story was plagued with inconsistencies. A scrap metal dealer called Michael Barrett found the diary and claimed that he was given it by a friend called Tony. However, the story then changed, and Barrett's wife claimed that it was in her family and passed down. Michael actually did admit to faking the diary, but then he later retracted the statement. Most initially believed it to have been a complete hoax. The book and its ink were analysed, and it did match the time of 1867 and the 1870s. More tests were administered and concluded that some of the ink weren't used commercially, however, until 1972, nearly 100 years after the murders took place. The handwriting also seemed more from the 20th century and not 1888. Some believe it is a genuine confession of Maybrick's secrets, but nothing is confirmed. Some details in the book describe the murders in great detail, with certain information that weren't available to the public at the time. Furthermore, some crime scene photographs show the initials FM written behind the victim's body in blood, which may be referring to James Maybrick's wife Florence, which would have been a motive, but nothing is definitive. However, a pocket watch was discovered that was owned by James Maybrick, with his name even on it, as well as the words "I am Jack" and the initials of the 5 canonical victims. This watch was analysed to determine if it was genuine or yet another false lead. On the basis of the evidence, especially the order in which the markings were made, it is clear that the engravings predate the vast majority of superficial surface scratch marks. The wear apparent on the engravings, evidenced by the rounded edges of the markings and polishing out in places, would indicate a substantial age. Whilst there is no evidence which would indicate a recent last few years origin, it must be emphasised that there are no features observed which conclusively prove the age of the engravings. They could have been produced recently and deliberately artificially aged by polishing, but this would have been a complex, multi-stage process. Many of the features are only resolved by the scanning electron microscope, not being readily apparent in optical microscopy. And so, if they were of recent origin, the engraver would have to be aware of the potential evidence available from this technique, indicating a considerable skill and scientific awareness. Provided the watches remained in a normal environment, it would seem likely that the engravings were at least several tens of years of age. In my opinion, it is unlikely that anyone would have sufficient expertise to implant aged brass particles into the base of the engravings. Unfortunately, the only evidence left behind may have been a complete waste. In 1931, 43 years after the first letter from the supposed murderer had been sent to the press, journalist Fred Best confessed to have written the letters, postcard and other messages from the murderer in an attempt to keep the case alive in the public interest, though some still dispute this confession and believe that they were genuine. After all, the handwriting were not the same for all 3. Who was the most famous serial killer in history? Was it a woman who was able to slip away undetected with ease? Was this a motive of a depressed lover, or just a random act of aggression and rage? Jack the Ripper is not only the most famous murderer in history, but one of the biggest unsolved mysteries we have ever seen that continues to baffle. And after 134 years, in regards to the identity and motive of Jack the Ripper, we remain seeking answers.